It was just past midnight when my phone rang. The harsh sound shattered the quiet of my sparsely furnished apartment. As an FBI agent, late-night calls were part of the job, but something about this one felt different from the moment I picked up. "Agent Daniels?" The voice on the other end was strained, breathless. "We need you on a scene immediately. It's unlike anything we've ever seen." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I kept my voice steady. "Calm down and give me the details." The officer's description was fragmented, each piece more disturbing than the last. An isolated farmhouse, miles away from the nearest neighbor. A single body found in a locked room, no sign of forced entry. Symbols, drawn in what seemed to be blood, covering the walls. The way he spoke, it was as if he was struggling to believe his own words. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, hanging up before the officer could respond. Driving through the deserted rural roads, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I had dealt with my fair share of gruesome crime scenes in my 15 years with the Bureau. Drug busts gone wrong, serial killers, human trafficking rings, I'd seen it all. But there was something in the officer's voice that hinted at a deeper, more primal fear. I prided myself on my logical mind and my refusal to entertain notions of the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and otherworldly forces were the stuff of fiction, not facts. But as the miles stretched on and the night grew darker, I couldn't help but feel that I was driving straight into a nightmare that defied all reason. The farmhouse emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the moonlit sky. It stood alone, surrounded by endless fields, the perfect picture of isolation. As I pulled up and stepped out of my car, the oppressive silence wrapped around me, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the tall grass. Whatever awaited me inside, I knew it would be a test of everything I believed. Little did I know, this would become the most bizarre, unsettling case of my career. The front door creaked open with a reluctance that mirrored my own as I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, metallic, sharp, and unmistakably blood. The farmhouse was unnervingly silent, every step I took echoing through the empty hallways. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing out of place in the entryway, but as I moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. In the living room, the first grotesque sight greeted me. Symbols, crudely drawn in dark, dried blood, covered the walls in a macabre tapestry. They seemed to pulse and shift in the dim light of my flashlight, making my skin crawl. I recognized some of the symbols from old case files, occult markings, used in rituals or by deranged minds trying to invoke something beyond our world. The body was in the bedroom, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The victim, a middle-aged man, was positioned in an unnatural, contorted pose, limbs bent at impossible angles. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, a look of pure terror frozen on his face. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, just that horrifying posture and those dreadful symbols. I scanned the room for anything that could provide a rational explanation. The windows were shut tight, no sign of tampering. The floorboards were undisturbed, no hidden passages or loose panels. It was as if the victim had been placed there by some unseen force. Then there were the other strange clues. A laptop sat on a small desk in the corner, still open and running. On the screen was a looped video feed from a surveillance camera outside the house. The footage showed nothing unusual at first, just the quiet exterior of the farmhouse. But then, at random intervals, objects would move on their own. A chair sliding across the porch, a door swinging open without a breeze. And then, the most chilling part, a shadowy figure, indistinct and fleeting, appearing in the corners of the frame, always just out of clear view. I couldn't explain it. None of it made any logical sense. My training, my experience, none of it prepared me for this. As I stood there, in that room of horrors, I felt a deep, gnawing fear. Not just for what had happened here, but for the unsettling realization that I was dealing with something far beyond the realm of human understanding. I began my investigation by speaking with the neighbors, although neighbors is a generous term in such a remote area. The nearest house was a mile away, and its occupants, an elderly couple named the Harrisons, were the first on my list. Mr. Harrison answered the door, his face lined with worry and age. He invited me in, and I could sense the fear lurking behind his polite demeanor. "We heard strange noises that night," he said, his voice trembling. "Screams, like nothing we'd ever heard before. Then, just silence." Mrs. Harrison, sitting quietly beside her husband, added, "There were lights, too. Bright flashes, like lightning, but the sky was clear. And a feeling, like something was watching us." Their accounts, though unsettling, were vague. They hadn't seen anyone or anything clearly. But the fear in their eyes was genuine, and it added to the growing unease I felt about this case. Next, I interviewed a local handyman, Joe, who had been working on the farmhouse the week before the incident. Joe was a tough, no-nonsense type, but even he seemed shaken. "I always felt like someone was watching me while I worked," he confessed. "Tools would go missing, only to show up in places I know I hadn't left them. And that old man, he said he heard whispers at night. I just thought he was losing it." As the interviews progressed, a pattern of strange occurrences and a palpable sense of dread emerged. There were no clear witnesses, no one who had seen anything concrete. Just fragments of fear and confusion. I turned to research, hoping to find some rational explanation. The local library's archives were my first stop. I dug through old newspapers, police reports, and any records I could find about the area. It didn't take long to uncover a history of odd happenings. In the early 1900s, the farmhouse had belonged to a family who had disappeared without a trace. Their case was never solved. In the 1950s, a group of teenagers who ventured there on a dare reported seeing apparitions and hearing disembodied voices. More recently, there had been whispers of occult activity, though nothing substantial ever came of it. One name kept appearing in the records, a local legend about a man named Ezekiel Thorne, who was rumored to have practiced dark rituals in the woods surrounding the farmhouse. Stories of his supposed ability to commune with malevolent spirits were dismissed as folklore, but now they seemed eerily relevant. My investigation was leading me deeper into the realm of the unexplainable. Each piece of information, each witness account, only deepened the mystery. I was left with more questions than answers and a growing sense that whatever had caused this horror was far from finished. The case was no longer just a bizarre anomaly, it was a descent into a nightmare that challenged everything I believed in. The more I delved into the case, the more the farmhouse seemed to take on a life of its own. On my fourth visit, I experienced the first of many inexplicable events. As I walked through the house, taking notes and trying to piece together the puzzle, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct, a hissing voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Leave this place." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. Just me and the oppressive silence that followed. I shook it off, convincing myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. Stress and lack of sleep could do that, after all. But it didn't stop there. The next night, as I reviewed the surveillance footage in my hotel room, I saw it again. The shadowy figure, moving across the screen, stopping to look directly into the camera. Its eyes were dark voids, and for a split second, I felt as if it were staring straight at me. I rewound the footage, but the figure was gone. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I returned to the farmhouse, determined to find a rational explanation. As I walked through the rooms, I heard footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. Objects started to move on their own, a chair sliding across the floor, a door creaking open. My skepticism was being eroded, bit by bit. I prided myself on my logical mind, but these experiences defied all explanation. My internal conflict grew, the logical part of me insisting there had to be a rational answer, while another part whispered that I was facing something beyond human understanding. The turning point came one night when I decided to stay in the farmhouse. I set up a cot in the living room, determined to catch whatever was causing these disturbances. It was past midnight when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound. The air was thick with tension, and I felt a deep sense of dread. As I turned the corner, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the end of the hallway. Its skin was pale and translucent, eyes black as coal. It didn't move, just stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. Then, it began to advance, gliding silently toward me. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Suddenly, it vanished, leaving me in the darkness, my heart racing and my mind reeling. There was no denying it anymore. I had witnessed something undeniably paranormal. My logical mind couldn't explain it, but the fear and the reality of what I had seen were inescapable. That night changed everything. I was no longer just investigating a bizarre case, I was confronting a terrifying reality that shook the very foundation of my beliefs. Whatever haunted that farmhouse was real, and it was far from finished with me. Despite my best efforts, the case remains officially unsolved. Every piece of concrete evidence I gathered seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. The surveillance footage, once so damning, now showed only empty rooms and the occasional flicker of static. The symbols on the walls, so clearly drawn in blood, had faded to barely visible stains. The eyewitness accounts, though compelling, were dismissed as unreliable, the ramblings of frightened minds. The official report concluded that the cause of death was indeterminate, and without tangible proof, the case was closed. But I knew the truth. I had seen the impossible, felt the cold grip of fear that only the supernatural can bring. The farmhouse was more than a crime scene, it was a portal to something dark and ancient, something that defied logic and explanation. The aftermath of that night left deep scars. I found it impossible to sleep, plagued by nightmares of that gaunt figure and its black, soulless eyes. The once comforting silence of my apartment now felt oppressive, every creak and whisper sending shivers down my spine. I began to see shadows in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers in the dead of night. My colleagues noticed the change, the haunted look in my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full truth. Who would believe me? I spent hours researching the paranormal, seeking answers in the very things I had once dismissed as fantasy. I spoke to occult experts, psychics, anyone who might provide a clue. But the more I learned, the more I realized how little I understood. The supernatural world was vast and terrifying, filled with entities and forces beyond our comprehension. And then, one night, as I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, I heard it again. That same low, guttural growl from the farmhouse, echoing through the darkness. I knew then that it wasn't over, that whatever had haunted that place had followed me. I was marked, a part of a story that would never truly end. To those who hear my story, I offer this warning: there are things in this world that defy reason, dark forces that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Be cautious of the places you tread, for once you cross into their domain, there is no going back. The farmhouse may be quiet now, but the entity that dwells within it is still out there, watching, waiting. And one day, it may come for you too.